people only want relationships because they're unequal?
They do.
This idea that men value respect more than they value love, whereas women value love more than they value respect.
I think that women want to be taken into account. They want to feel heard. They want to feel like their preferences matter.
Orion Taraban is a clinical psychologist who specializes in the psychology of modern dating and the differences in what men and women value in relationships.
If I'm receiving attention from women because I am a doctor, or I am wealthy, or I am famous, or I am high status, and if I am significantly older and more experienced in relationships, then it doesn't make sense that we would equally share the direction or the decision-making of that relationship.
Here we get into everything from relationships to psychology to depression and some of the little-known secrets of therapy and psychiatry.
The most effective treatment for depression is behavioral activation. It's more effective than SSRIs. A lot of men have been told since they were very young to respect all women, to respect all women, to respect all women. This can sometimes be interpreted by men to, well, I'm going to remove all of my sexual intent from my communications and interactions with women. One of the dirty little secrets of both therapy and psychiatry is that, according to the research, the vast majority of mental illnesses spontaneously remit. They run their course. For example, Zimbabwe has better clinical outcomes associated with schizophrenia than the United States. In general, the more industrialized the medical care of a society, the worse its mental health outcomes are.
Ryan, welcome back.
Hi, Joseph. Thanks for having me, man.
Of course.
It's really good to be here.
Should we kick off with some sort of update?
Oh, yeah. I'm still doing my private practice. I'm still doing consultations with men and women from all around the world, usually who find me through the YouTube channel. I recently published my first book on psychology called The Value of Others, which I'm really happy about, very excited about that, and for that to be out in the market. I've been working on it for quite some time. It's probably the closest I'm going to come to experiencing what it might be like to be pregnant and give birth. It was like a 9-month process to gestate this inside of me. And certainly by the end of it, I was really ready for it to be out into the world. And I'm excited to see what kind of life it will lead now that it's sort of an independent entity that's been separated from my private consciousness.
Can you give us a quick kind of synopsis of the book or a preview of the book? Kind of what we should expect?
The subtitle of the book is Understanding Relationships Through the Lens of Behavioral Economics. So the fundamental premise of the book is that everybody is trying to have a relationship with their perceived best option. And if you can accept the truth of that premise, it means that the perception of value, perceived best, perception of value, is at the core of all human relationships. This means that to understand relationships, you have to understand perception, which is psychological, actually a fairly complex cognitive phenomenon. And you have to understand the transaction of value, which is economics. So I call this behavioral economics, the marriage of psychology and economic principles. And using just a few of these principles, you can explain a great deal of the behavior that occurs in the sexual marketplace.
I had a question I wanted to ask you regarding equal relationships, but and I was going to ask you later, but this seems actually quite relevant to what you're saying. So I had this thought that if you're trying to equate how two people are acting in a relationship to achieve an equal relationship, maybe in terms of respect or something, you will have, let's say, the two partners are trying to give each other equal amounts of respect. But then you might have both partners perceive respect in different ways.
Certainly.
Is that kind of what you're talking about?
Well, what I say is that the basis of transaction is the exchange of unequal goods of comparable value. Both things kind of need to be true. We actually want to exchange unequal goods. Like if I said, hey, Joseph, will you give me $1 for $1? Like that's a useless transaction. And in fact, we've lost a little bit of time and opportunity if we actually went through with transacting it. That's why that doesn't happen. People actually don't transact equal things. They transact unequal, i.e. different things, but those different things have to be of comparable value. The more that the perceived value of those unequal things is different, the less likely a transaction is going to occur, right? So you have to also understand that if there's this inequality at the heart of transaction, which is the basis of relationship, that inequality in relationships is the rule. It's not the exception. And on some level, humans are only equal in the abstract. And that's a useful concept because it keeps society from going too off the rails. But if you look at people and you listen to people, you'll see that they are very unequal in terms of their capabilities, in terms of their appearances, in terms of their status, in terms of pretty much any way that you'd like to quantify. And those are the things that people consider when they think about entering into a relationship with person A versus any other, person B. Right? They have to make their decision based on something that they can observe or perceive. And anything that's the same between two options is irrelevant because you're going to get it both ways. And so people use inequality to facilitate decision making. They need people to be unequal, or else anybody would be just as good as anybody else, which is clearly not how people act in the game of mating and dating. People are not just saying, I'll take anybody, right? That we don't see that. So people are using inequality to facilitate decision making. And of course, if there was no inequality, no one could enter into a relationship with their perceived best option because nothing would be better than anything else, right?
Interesting. So the video that I put out with you, the clip that I had put on my main channel before, was titled "Women Don't Want Equal Relationships," but maybe more accurately would be people only want relationships because they're unequal.
They do. It's like, think about and that inequality is, the usefulness of that inequality is based on the type of relationship that you're looking for. So, for example, if your toilet gets clogged up, you'll need to call a plumber, right? And certain attributes of plumbers will be more useful to consider than others. Like, you're less likely to consider how kind a given plumber is versus other plumbers when you're faced with that kind of decision, right? Kindness doesn't really matter as much as, say, availability or affordability or competence, right? So the types of inequalities that we discern are relative to the type of relationship that we're looking to enter into.
Okay.
I don't know if that answers your question. Can you repeat your question to me?
Part of what I wanted to get to was like, is an equal relationship, is that even a useful phrase?
It can be, depending on which side of the inequality you're on.
Okay. How do you mean?
Well, usually those who have less are more vocal about espousing equality.
Okay.
So having an equal share might mean getting more than you otherwise would.
I see. This is kind of moving things toward the middle is going to be more advantageous to the person who is lower.
Well, sure. Yeah. And that's because what's equal isn't always fair, and what's fair isn't always equal. And everyone kind of remembers that when it's time to split a bill at a restaurant, right? Like if we go out and you have the steak and I have a salad, I wouldn't think it would be fair if we split the bill equally. You might think it's fair, because you might benefit from that equality.
Another thing on that note, I think this relates quite well, is I wanted to ask you about this idea that men value respect more than they value love, whereas women value love more than they value respect. So in that circumstance, let's say men and women are giving each other equal respect, whatever that means. They're giving each other equal respect. So then from the man's perspective, wouldn't that kind of be like he's not getting enough respect because the woman doesn't value the respect as much as she values love? Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, we have to address some of the assumptions there, because I've heard this before, and it's actually fairly contentious, as you might imagine, right? So there was a book, I think it was called Love and Respect. I haven't read it, but so you take that as a caveat, but I've read the synopsis of it. And that book basically was based on a survey that was given to several hundred men and several hundred women that basically asked them to make a forced choice, which was something like, would you rather be respected and alone, or would you rather be loved and like invalidated or something like that? And what this survey found was that around 75% of men would prefer to be respected but alone, and 75% of women would rather be loved but invalidated. And the premise of that book is therefore that respect is more important to men and love is more important to women, which predictably caused a minor uproar among women. Because I think it would probably be more accurate to say that to a woman, she'd rather have both. Women hear that, it's like, well, why can't I have both? Why do I have to choose? I want to be loved and I want to be respected. And in fact, I think that study was replicated with a different sample. I don't remember the sample that was used from the book, but the sample that it was replicated on was a cohort of young women at Harvard University. So these were very ambitious, intelligent young women. And when they were forced to make that choice between being respected but alone and loved but invalidated, they responded like the men did in the previous study. 75% of them said that they would prefer to be respected but alone. So I think that we have to understand that the value of respect and love differ depending on the context in which you hope to transact the most value. If you're looking to transact value in the commercial or professional arena, why do you need to be loved? It's not nearly as useful as being respected. So if women more and more are looking to derive most of their value, most of their sense of self-worth in the professional arena, in the game of status in the larger society, it makes sense that they're increasingly going to value respect. I don't think it's necessarily a gendered thing, though I do think there tend to be some differences in how the genders tend to perceive respect. Okay? So this is very difficult because, first of all, respect can mean many different things. I made a video about this, and one of the backlashes that it received was this conflation of two ideas that's meant by the term respect. Some people mean respect to mean like basic human consideration or dignity. And in that way, everybody deserves respect. But that's often not how it's being used in this context. Usually, respect is being used to denote some sort of like acknowledgement of special significance or ability. And I think that's how men generally understand it, which is like, for me to respect you, you have to do something excellently. You have to demonstrate some ability or some competence that impresses me. And so you've earned that respect. In the sense of respect as basic human dignity, no one has to earn it. It's just as like given as an inalienable human right? But men tend to perceive respect more as something earned. Whereas women might think, well, I just want to be respected in kind of like the human dignity department. Now, this also creates difficulties between men and women because it's very difficult for respect and sexualization to occur at the same time. Okay? So it's like a man who feels respect for someone does not feel sexual urges towards that person. Like the idea of like, I respect you for your strength or your intelligence or your prowess, and by consequence of that, I want to fuck you. Like that doesn't make sense. And in fact, in any kind of ritual or ceremony that's respect-oriented, like a funeral or a graduation or an award ceremony, like sexualizing the recipient would be completely inappropriate. We would think that's almost disgusting, like we're tarnishing their respect. And so this is difficult because when a lot of men have been told since they were very young to respect all women, to respect all women, to respect all women, this can sometimes be interpreted by men to, well, I'm going to remove all of my sexual intent from my communications and interactions with women. Now, from a social perspective, a lot of women would be like, well, what's the problem with that? Because I get it. It's like to be inappropriately sexualized against one's will is not a pleasant or comfortable experience. And I wouldn't want to be sexualized in a professional context or by people that I would rather not be sexualized by. But if I'm also never sexualized by anyone, it's very difficult to enter into a sexual relationship now, is it? Yeah. Right? So on some level, male sexuality requires the ability to compartmentalize the person from, even like the body. Like male sexuality depends on objectification. Mm-hmm. It's very difficult to take a woman that you love and cherish and bend her over. You know what I'm saying? So it's like, and that we also see this in the case of like the Madonna whore complex, which can happen after women give birth, is that men find it difficult to sexualize that woman because now she's not just his lover or his wife, she's the mother of his children. And so the woman gets bound up in his own psychological associations with motherhood, where there's lots of taboos around sexualization, right? And so a lot of times it's difficult when the man can't separate the mother from the wife to sexualize the woman. And that can create difficulties in that relationship.
So objectification is is that a necessary component for a man to get aroused, or is that the result of arousal?
I think they're probably in a reciprocal influence. Like the more aroused a man is, the more likely he's going to compartmentalize and objectify. And on some level, the ability to compartmentalize and objectify makes it easier to get aroused. Okay. We see this in like the types of pornography that men and women use. It's like there's really no narrative to men's pornography. It's like, oh, a pizza's here and now, we're fucking. So it's like there doesn't need to be that context. The other person isn't really a person. The other person in most male pornographies are just like a tool for sexual satisfaction. And that can make women uncomfortable, right? Because they don't want to feel like they disappear in the act of the sexual encounter. But the more that the person is present, the harder it is to objectify.
Do you think that has to do with the fact that men become aroused very easily? So, for example, a man can kind of, let's say, imagine what's valuable to him sexually at almost any moment's notice. But for a woman to really consider what turns her on, she has to first be in that state, or she's not really accessed, or it's kind of harder for her to get into that mindset of like, oh yeah, okay, I guess that would be a turn on for me. Or do you think that has nothing to do with it?
That might be possible because it's a state-based phenomenon. It's like I don't know any man who does enjoy watching pornography when they're not feeling aroused. So they can use pornography in order to get aroused, right?
Right. Like they could be, it could be there, and then they just see it and they're kind of a little aroused, right? It's not too much is required to get into that mental state.
Yeah, I think that men tend to be aroused more easily and more quickly than women. Yes.
So to clarify my question, I was asking more, why is it hard for women to kind of, so you were saying how let's be respectful all the time and never sexualize women. Women are thinking like, yeah, that sounds great. I would love that. I would love not to be.
Because they're thinking about, I don't want to be inappropriately sexualized when I don't want to be.
Okay.
That's what I think anyway.
I guess I'm just wondering, are you trying to say that they don't, not some part of them is like, well, I want to be sexualized sometimes.
Yeah, you would think, right? But when you talk about, respect all women, this is a political and social mantra. It takes place in that context. But when men hear that, they think at all times, under all circumstances. But yeah, there should be a little asterisk next to that, which is that a lot of women would prefer to be sexualized by the men that they would prefer to be sexualized by, right? but they leave that part out. And so a lot of guys just hear, oh, respect all women, all the time, under all circumstances. And that often leads to them repressing or even denying their own sexual attraction or interest to other women, which generally doesn't lead to sexual relationships.
So earlier we were talking about how, this concept of men prioritize respect over love, or at least some people are saying this, men prioritize respect over love and women prioritize love over respect. Do you think it's safer to say that simply they have different conceptualizations of respect?
Well, they certainly do. Like the word that I think that women might want to use instead is consideration. I think that women want to be taken into account. They want to feel heard. They want to feel like their preferences matter and that the man is willing to accommodate her feedback and her interests and preferences.
I see.
Which I think is consideration. I think that's a better word for it.
As you were saying earlier, men respect each other's skill level, their competence, what they've achieved, and so on. But I think there's kind of a thing in the man's world of whose idea should we consider, whose opinion should we consider? Well, only the guy who has the most, or the guys who have the highest experience with this. So, for example, if you have like a 10-year kickboxer and a guy who just started, he's like, oh, well, I want you to hear my opinions about how to kick. They're like, no.
Sure, yeah.
Right? So could that lead to some conflicts?
Of course.
Okay. Yeah, between men and women, right? Mm-hmm. I was talking to a couple of my friends about the video that I had released with you earlier, the one that I titled Women Don't Want Equal Relationships. And then it was all about what do equal relationships mean? What do they want when they're saying they want a 50-50 relationship? And one of the pushbacks was, no, what an equal relationship is that it's equal levels of respect. I said, okay, well, what does that mean? They say, well, it's equal levels of decision making. And then I was thinking, well, women are attracted to men who are more experienced, have more money, more financial prospects, all this, right? So if they're attracted to that kind of person who has accrued the experience that would make them a better decision maker, does it make sense to have equal? No. Okay. Equal levels of decision making?
No, I mean, I don't think it does. And I think that's also a function of where the man and women are when they decide to enter into the relationship. When people are high school or college sweethearts and they both have limited experience and they both have, in either the real world or in having relationships, yeah, they can kind of like stumble along together in a lot of respects. But if I'm receiving attention from women because I am a doctor, or I am wealthy, or I am famous, or I am high status, then, and if I am significantly older and more experienced in relationships, then it doesn't make sense that we would equally share the direction or the decision-making of that relationship. Because I've spent potentially years creating the structure of my lifestyle before you, the woman, even showed up. So the person who built the ship is generally in the best position to helm it because they actually created it, plank by plank. They know it better than anybody else. This gives them, I think, legitimate authority to direct the course of that ship. And of course, the flip side of that is that they're more responsible for the ship as well, because you can't really have power without responsibility, at least not legitimate power. So the person who built that structure should be empowered to direct that structure. And that person who built that structure is also going to be on the hook for addressing any problems that come up within that structure. You can't have it both ways.
How should the people in a relationship approach that? Because women feel respected when they feel considered, when they feel heard, and when they're, when they're heard and considered. But men maybe feel that they have more right to decision making, especially when it comes to things that they have more experience with.
Yeah, it's difficult. There's not going to be a one-size-fits-all solution here. Like I said, I think that I made a video once that like only founders get equity. So if a woman and a man get together when they kind of both have nothing and they both build the structure of their lives together, then I don't see any reason why they shouldn't be equal shareholders in the direction of that lifestyle or relationship. Because they built it. They're one of the founders, right? But if you weren't involved in the construction of the lifestyle and you just show up once it's become a successful extrapolated thing, you don't typically get equity, you get a salary. Because you didn't assume a lot of the risks and expenses and responsibilities to develop that company, to develop that lifestyle. So you wouldn't be entitled to share in the decision-making or the revenue of that company as if you were somebody who assumed those risks, expenses, and responsibilities. That doesn't make any sense. But of course, it is a tactic to potentially get more power than might be appropriate.
Does this conversation of equal relationships and differences in opinion of what an equal relationship means come up very often, say from your clinical experience? Because I feel like it doesn't really show up too much here in Japan. So I guess what I'm saying is, living here in Japan for such a long time, my perspective in terms of like how much of this is an issue, I don't have the best perspective, but what do you think?
Oh yeah, it comes up a lot. And usually it has to do with investment in a relationship. And the fact of the matter is that you can be invested emotionally, like in terms of devotion or loyalty, and you can be invested materially in terms of things that you do or ways that you instrumentally support the lifestyle, okay? And in general, one person is invested more in one way than the other. In general, the person who's more materially invested is less emotionally invested, and vice versa. But not always the case, but that's generally what's true. And what can often happen is that people argue about which form of investment is more valuable. And this is the situation where, stereotypically it could be like, hey, I'm the woman, I'm cleaning the house, I'm raising the children, I do all of that, you do nothing. I do so much, I'm invested, you're not. And so I deserve to have a greater share of the power and the authority. By the same token, the man could say, yeah, but I pay for everything. I'm going out and working, and I'm surrendering that income that I could otherwise keep to myself to support you and the children. And so I deserve more power and decision-making authority. And so they go back. So these arguments that are subject to arising about investment are really about power. And the goal of these conversations is to try to convince the other person that they're benefiting more.
I see.
Because if I can convince you that you are benefiting more from me than I am from you, then you need me more than I need you, which puts me in a more powerful position.
So that's ultimately because they want to feel like they're in a more powerful position?
Sure. Who wants to feel like they're in a less powerful position?
So is it going to be constantly a tug of war throughout the whole relationship? Or do you ever find a balancing point?
It depends on the personalities of the people involved. I mean, there are some folks who, because of their ideals or their temperaments, they want as close to an equal power dynamic as possible. Now, I don't think it's possible for two people to have exactly the same amount of power in any kind of dynamic. So one person will always have more, one person always has less, but the gap there could be very small. Some people are more comfortable with bigger gaps. It just sort of depends on the temperaments and the personalities of the people involved. Big power gaps can actually be very stable.
This is probably super simplistic, but you would think that a woman would be more comfortable in the lower power position because in general, she's attracted to people who are more powerful than her. Men who are more powerful than her.
Yes. Yeah. But it's complex, right? Have you ever felt crummy about something that you were attracted to?
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay.
Like, I hate that I love that.
Yeah. I see. Okay, so it sounds like this could go two ways. Is she is attracted to a guy who's more powerful than her, but she actually doesn't, she kind of resents it to some degree, so then she wants to engage in this tug of war. Or could it be a form of, let's say, testing his capabilities of, okay, if you're really that powerful, I'm going to fight with you for it. And depending on your reaction, that'll give me like some reassurance that you are deserving of the powerful position that you're in.
That can happen for sure. Yeah. Well, one of the prerogatives of the less powerful party is to test the more powerful party. I talk about that in the book. I talk about captains and passengers. Captains have challenges they need to overcome, and passengers have prerogatives that they can execute. And one of the three prerogatives of the passenger is to test the captain. And that makes all the sense in the world. Like people generally don't treat cars that they test drive very well, right? As soon as they're out of earshot of the dealership, they are slamming on the brakes and whipping around corners and kicking the tires because they want to stress the system. They want to create every opportunity for any latent defect or problem to emerge before they sign the contract. And then afterwards, they generally drive the car off the lot with the most care than they ever will in their entire lives, right? No one treats a car better than a new owner. But no one treats a car worse than somebody that hasn't made a decision yet.
It reminds me of this in David Buss's book, Evolutionary Psychology. He gave an example of a bullfrog, I think it was, and they would select their male partners by literally ramming into them.
Yeah, I know that
and
one.
You know what I'm talking about, right? And so seeing how much
they can withstand, right?
Yeah, how much they can withstand or recoil or whatever.
Yeah, because there's a lot of deceptive signals in the marketplace. There's a lot of people playing dress up. It's very easy to buy a captain's outfit.
So this concept of a shit test is, the idea is that women will act a certain way, not necessarily because, or they might say like, oh, why don't you ever do this? And it doesn't necessarily mean if you do that thing, I will be happier and the relationship will be better. It is more to test the reaction, to kind of assess, to further assess the competence or the just nature of their partner.
It can be. It can be.
And do you think that's pretty common, or that's a rare occurrence?
Yeah, it's fairly common. It should, however, die down after you sign the contract, just like the test drive. If a woman is still testing years into a relationship, that doesn't make a lot of sense. Ruling out the possibility that the man has somehow declined over that timeline, like he's lost some status or his wealth, or he's not doing the things that he used to do, then the testing might resume again. But in the absence of that, it's like after years, you should have made your decision. And the testing becomes an expensive distraction from the actual purpose of the relationship if it goes on for too long. The purpose of a relationship is not to test the integrity of the relationship. It's to do other things. It's to raise children, or to make love, or to enjoy each other's company. It's not to constantly focus on the relationship.
Sure, but do you think it could still appear at some points, maybe just kind of want to poke at him because it's fun?
It can happen because that the man is somehow in a decline, or that the relationship is becoming more serious and it's entering into a more considerable level of emotional investment. So if a woman is engaging with a man more or less in a casual style, there might be some testing, usually not that much. But if she starts to fall in love or develop feelings, or there's talk about marriage or children, there might be a resumed and more intensive stage of testing at that time, because that might not be how she was really approaching that guy up until that time. And so now she has other factors or qualities that she needs to assess before she can feel comfortable about moving the relationship to that stage.
Not the best analogy, but maybe stress testing yourself a bit before you decide to run a marathon. Like, okay, let's see let me kind of put myself to the test and do like a half marathon before I agree to Marathon. Okay, something like that.
Well, or you can think about it in a corporate perspective, which is you might have been hired at this job, but hopefully you're not going to stay at that level indefinitely over the course of your career. But it's not a foregone conclusion that just because you've put in the time, you're going to be promoted. Usually a promotion comes with other responsibilities and privileges, I hope, and therefore requires different suites of skills. And so the testing occurs again.
Do you run into this with your clients where men seem to be misinterpreting these so-called tests?
All the time.
Okay.
Because they can be really infuriating. They can. They seem disrespectful. They can seem irrelevant. They can seem arbitrary. They can seem, many different things. Yeah, it's very difficult to feel like, on some level, there has to be a humility in men and in women, I suppose, but in this case we're talking about men, in men to allow themselves to be subjected to analysis. That basically means that I'm putting myself lower than you, at least for this time of evaluation. You wouldn't go up to someone of higher power and authority and suggest that I need to evaluate you. That would be impudent. And that can be interpreted as impudence in sexual relationships as well.
I see.
If it's not handled with patience and humility by the man on the one hand, and with tact and, let's say, care on the part of the woman.
It makes sense. You don't want to, you want to stress test the guy to make sure that if something important does come up, or later in the future, when something does important come up, he's not just going to kind of flip out or maybe even be violent or something like that.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. But you have to understand that the bigger the power differential between any two people, the harder it is to accomplish that.
Right.
It's like if I were to go up to a presidential candidate and just say, hey, you don't know me from Adam, but I need you to tell me why I should vote for you. It's like, well, who are you to demand that of that person's time and attention?
Yeah.
And it certainly probably wouldn't be worthwhile for that candidate to take a lot of time out of his campaign to try to convert the heart and mind of a single voter. Do you understand? There's an opportunity cost associated with that the private citizen just might not even be able to consider. So the bigger the power imbalance, the harder it is to actually test.
So why don't we switch gears for a bit? I wanted to ask you a little bit about depression and sex differences in depression, or differences between men and women in terms of what leads to depression.
There do seem to be some consistent sex differences in the experience of depression between men and women. The depression the syndrome of depression as it is described in the DSM tends to be a more feminine version of depression, in the sense of like it's sad or depressed mood. That can happen to men, obviously. But the gendered expression of that sadness in men sometimes gets masked by anger or irritability. And so I think the primary difference in the expression of depression in men and women is like the tone of the emotion. In men, depression can often be anger, it can be irritability, it can be like restlessness. Whereas with women, it can be more like being kind of mopey, low energy, being in your feelings, things like that. So I think because that often accords more with the textbook definition of depression, women tend to get diagnosed with depression more than men, which is true. But I think that obscures the true prevalence of depression in men because it's often not recognized as such, according to the popular diagnostic criteria.
Do you think that would mean that potentially the rates of depression in men is actually higher, or men's depression could be confused for another ailment?
Oh, sure. Just that you're an asshole, basically. A lot of mean men are sad men. And it's hard, and it's harder to sympathize with an angry man than with a sad man, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know what the true levels of depression in men would be relative to women. I would say they're probably comparable, because I think a lot of depression has to do with, let's say, being unsuccessful in life. And both men and women, on the whole, generally aren't getting what they want from life.
Does that mean you mean unsuccessful in terms of they are not being able to move up the so-called social hierarchy as well as they think, or maybe they've been knocked down a bit?
Can be.
Okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, what are the components of a good life? Is that you have satisfying and meaningful work that provides you with enough money to facilitate your lifestyle. You have close, loving, respectful relationships with both men and women. You are healthy in your body. You're physically fit. You feel like you can use your body as an instrument to accomplish goals in material reality. You have a sense of wonder and curiosity that sees the world as an opportunity to explore and learn and grow, as opposed to some sort of indifferent or antagonistic force that's always there to squash you down. Things like that. It's still possible to be depressed even if you're rich and married and high status, but it's harder to be depressed under those conditions. And at the very least, we should rule out that first, is that maybe you're depressed because your depression is an accurate reflection that your life isn't very good. That certainly was the case with me personally. I was very depressed when I was younger, but my life was miserable in many respects. You know, I was young, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's hard to be a young man because you are sort of useless to both other men and to women. You're useless to other men because you don't really have any competencies or skills or experiences that they can use. Like, you are not a very good teammate. You're kind of a liability on the team because I have to take care of you. And women don't really want you because unless you're very attractive, you don't have anything that they want to transact for in a sexual relationship. So it's very difficult. A young man basically exists at the bottom of every single status hierarchy. Whereas young women can exist on the bottom of, let's say, professional status hierarchies, but by consequence of being young, which in and of itself is going to make them desirable to the vast swath of men, they're not at the bottom of the relationship status hierarchy, right? And so they have a little bit of a buffer there. When people are at the bottom of status hierarchies, when they are poor, when they are alone and friendless, when they are lonely, when they are potentially addicted either to substances or processes that numb them from those emotional pains, they tend to be depressed. Now, does that mean that if you fix all of those problems in lifestyle that the depression will always go away? Probably not always, but in the vast majority of cases, yeah. It's harder to be depressed when life is better.
One thing I really liked about Dave Grohl was someone, I feel like this isn't so common with celebrities or rock stars. Someone asked him, what's it like to be a rock star? He's like, it's fucking awesome.
Yeah, he's probably telling the truth, man.
Whereas it feels like there's this thing in the culture where we want to paint people who are more successful, celebrities, who are more successful, they're famous, they have more money, as kind of like, oh, they have all this money and stuff, but they're probably addicted to drugs and not doing too well.
Well, a lot of them are. I mean, that is true. Sometimes success, especially if it happens quickly, is one of the most dangerous things that can happen to another person. A lot of people are protected from their own self-destruction, not because of their virtue or discipline, but because they lack the means to facilitate their destruction to its ultimate conclusion.
I see.
Whereas sometimes winning the lottery, for example, if you don't have the discipline and the virtue to create restrictions on your behavior when external restrictions no longer exist, will destroy your life. And we see that over and over again with some celebrities, especially when they become famous very quickly and often very young.
So going back to this situation where it might just be the case that a man is presenting as depressed, but it could be the result of his life just not going well. He hasn't had really much success. Is that often recognized by psychiatrists or therapists or clinical psychologists? Do they often say like, okay, hold up, before I give you a pill, what's going on in your life? Tell me.
I mean, I don't think that's generally the case. And, you lumped a lot of different classes of specialists together. And so it's hard for me to speak on all of those levels. But in general, different classes of professionals have different go-to interventions. It's like, don't ask a barber if you need a haircut. He's going to tell you that you do because he's got the scissors in his hands, right? So psychiatrists are uniquely empowered to prescribe medication. And so that's generally the solution that they are going to offer to their clients. Not, well, I'm only going to prescribe this to you once you lose 50 pounds and get a consistent exercise regimen and you get out into the sunlight for at least 40 minutes a day and you go to at least 2 social events a week and you reconnect with your old friends. It's like, no, they're booking in 15-minute appointment increments. They don't have time to do that. And to be fair, often the people who go to psychiatrists aren't looking for that. So it's a mutually created situation where people go to psychiatrists to get the pills. They're expecting the pills from the psychiatrist, and the psychiatrists are going to be giving the pills. But in my estimation, somebody who prescribes medication without talking about your lifestyle, without talking about your fitness, without talking about your friends, without talking about your work, without talking about your routines, is not really a doctor. That person is really a drug dealer. And that's what they're there to do. Now, this is, I would say, reinforced by the most dominant conceptualization of the origin of depression that exists in our culture, which is the monoamine hypothesis, which is basically that depression is caused by an imbalance in brain chemicals, usually serotonin with depression, right? What's interesting about the monoamine hypothesis is that the scientists who first formulated that, I think in the 70s, actually recanted it in the 90s due to a lack of evidence. There was a recent, what do they call it? A recent meta-analysis that was done on examining the influence of serotonin in particular on depression. And I cite this in a video on my channel that shows that there is no relationship, no demonstrated relationship between serotonin levels and depression. Not just no correlation, no relationship. And this has been long demonstrated, is that tighter levels of serotonin can be high in people with depression and low in people with depression. It can also be high in people without depression and low in people without depression. There is no relationship that we have observed consistently between serotonin levels and the experience and expression of depression. But it exists, this belief exists and is perpetuated in our society because there's a truthiness to it. It sounds like it could make sense, right? Especially because we conceive of mental experience to be the product of the brain, right? So if I'm somehow dysregulated in the mind, it must mean that there is some sort of comparable dysregulation in the brain. And of course, if the problem is in the brain, I can't really do anything about it because I can't actually change my brain. One of my pet peeves are people on the internet, sometimes they're professionals, who like train your brain. That phrase, train your brain, really gets on my nerves because you can't do it. You can't. Like, you can train your bicep. You know that if you do this curl with a weight in your hand, your bicep will get bigger. But you can't be like, well, I'm going to do this exercise and it's going to improve the cortical thickness of my anterior cingulate gyrus. Like, you cannot target your brain in that way. And even if you could, it doesn't necessarily mean that increasing the cortical thickness of your anterior cingulate gyrus is going to lead to this host of benefits, because the way that the brain actually operates in a given individual is very idiosyncratic, very idiosyncratic. So this is disempowering to a lot of people, because it basically says that if the problem is in my brain, there's nothing I can do about it, which also means that I'm dependent on a host, like a specialist class, who are uniquely positioned to intervene on the brain level to help me solve this problem.
Are you familiar with Chris Palmer's work?
I don't think so.
So he talks a lot about how the issues with metabolism can severely affect how the brain operates.
Sure, that makes sense.
And how particularly a ketogenic diet or the state of ketosis has some sort of restorative properties to where it has shown a lot of beneficial effects for depression, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, epilepsy. I mean,
I've read some interesting meta-analyses that suggest that one of the most effective treatments with respect to schizophrenia, which is usually the mental illness that is most strongly associated with biological or brain-based abnormalities, can be effectively treated with multivitamins in terms of like the symptomatic expression of schizophrenia.
To get back to SSRIs or antidepressants,
there's a great book on this. Let me interrupt for a second, because now we're talking about SSRIs. There's a great book for those who are interested on this subject called Anatomy of an Epidemic. Have you read this book?
Yeah.
It's awesome.
Very good.
Robert Whitaker, I actually heard him speak because he was the keynote speaker at the American Psychological Association's national convention several years ago in Chicago, where I was also presenting. Just a poster that nobody came to see, but I did present there. And this book is phenomenal. Like, it's so well researched, and it's so, I think, persuasive with respect to its overall arguments, that it's very difficult to refute. And one of the things he talks about is the fact that, as far as he was able to determine, there has yet to be a well-controlled, randomized controlled trial between an SSRI and an active placebo, that's an important part, that consistently alleviated the experience of depression.
Wow. You would think that would be almost the starting point.
Sure.
So what do we have data on what the maybe number needed to treat or success rate with antidepressants at like actual? The best that I could do with respect to antidepressants and depression is, according to my research, is that it is most beneficial to those with very severe depression, like catatonic depression. They can't get out of bed. They can't maintain basic self-care. Is that SSRIs do tend to be useful in that population. But among mild to moderate expressions of depression, SSRIs generally do not. And this is contentious because a lot of people will hear this and say, but I took antidepressants and they helped me personally. And this is the difference between examining statistics, which occur on a population level, and talking about idiopathic or idiosyncratic, is that right? Idiosyncratic? You mean unique?
Yeah. Particular effects in this individual. Someone might say, no, it's like the danger of talking about anything. Like, one of the comments in our last conversation was, look at all these generalizations these two men are making about men and women. And it's like, okay, well, on an individual level, you will find exceptions to any generalization. But that doesn't necessarily disprove the validity of the generalization on the population level. That's the nature of statistical inference.
Another thing is that I had read somewhere that one of the strongest predictors of being able to get out of a depression was any intervention that gives the patient hope. Does that sound accurate? I remember reading this at one point.
My understanding, according to the research I did in grad school, was the most effective treatment for depression is behavioral activation. It's more effective than SSRIs. Behavioral activation is basically like, do it even though you don't feel like doing it. Like, get out of the house, call a friend, like go to the gym. You're not going to feel like doing it. On some level, you have to do violence to your will. One of the things I talk about on my channel is that like emotions are living things. You can think of them like living things. And living things, their primary objective is to continue to exist. Like all living things want to continue to survive. Mm-hmm. And any emotion you have will want to continue to exist. That's why you got to think about emotions are not just like a mood or a feeling. They're a full psychological phenomenon. They affect your memory. They affect your attention. They affect your arousal. Do you understand? And so if you're depressed, you're more likely to attend to morose or decaying aspects of your environment. If you're depressed, you're more likely going to remember all the times that you've been invalidated and forgotten and disrespected. And all of those things are designed to perpetuate the state of depression, which as a living thing wants to continue to exist.
Right. So the depression is only generating, or it's mainly generating mental states that are going to continue the depression.
Absolutely. That are in alignment with that state. Exactly.
And rumination is one of the core, a big symptom of depression, right? So that it's kind of that.
Yeah. I mean, I think that you can generally say that depression is kind of inappropriate preoccupation with the past, and anxiety might be inappropriate preoccupation with the future, for example. Yeah, rumination doesn't usually help people. Sometimes after a loss, we should watch the tape, right? Like after we lose a football game, we should watch the tape to see where we should have zigged as opposed to zagged, or rushed instead of passed, etc. But if you're still watching that same tape years later, you're no longer learning anything from that tape. You're torturing yourself. You might say to yourself that I'm learning, I need to understand. That's often because there's a trap to the question of why. Like, why did this happen? Why did I lose? Why did she leave me? Why was I, et cetera, et cetera. And why questions ultimately don't have an answer. And so some people can be caught in a perpetual cycle of rumination because they're seeking for an answer to a question that doesn't exist. I've certainly fallen prey to that myself.
That makes a lot of sense. Have you read Abigail Schreier's book? It's called, I think that's her name, Abigail Schreier, Bad Therapy. Okay. It's very interesting. I wouldn't be surprised if you're familiar with most of the content in there. But one of the very good points she makes in there is that, well, one, she's establishing how prevalent therapy is in very young people nowadays. So you'll have 12, 13-year-olds going to tons of therapy in the States, apparently. And she says the issue with that is you're having kids who are really not that bad off. Maybe they just have typical fitting in problems. They're a little anxious at school because they're not fitting in and they're still learning their place. But they'll go to therapy and they're constantly asked, how do you feel? How are you feeling right now? And it's almost kind of like this situation that is simulated rumination. So simulated constant focus on your internal state, right? And so basically she's making the argument that, well, this is generating issues. It is creating issues out of thin air.
It can, absolutely. Like there is a time to attend to your inner state and there's a time to absolutely be indifferent to it. Sometimes you just have to do things. Like I made an episode about how to be disciplined. And the analogy I use is that you have to channel your inner postman. So in America, the USPS has this motto that's basically like, neither rain nor snow nor even hail will keep the postman from his appointed rounds, or something like that, which is basically to say that the postman doesn't wake up in the morning, look out the window and say, oh, it looks cold. I don't know if I really feel like going out and doing that. It's like, it doesn't fucking matter. You deliver the mail because that's your job. And so on some level, the worst question to ask yourself in certain contexts is, do I feel like doing this? Or how do I feel? Because that opens the door to an inappropriate doubt or deliberation that will only hesitate or obstruct the effective action or dischargement of your duty. And with respect to depression, I was saying about behavioral activation, It's like fuck your feelings. You have to do it in spite of what you feel. Everything inside of you is going to hate leaving your house or interacting with other people or picking up the phone. Fuck it, do it anyway.
I'm sure you're familiar with Nietzsche. Like the core idea behind his will to power concept is that power, to define power, you have to understand how to accrue it. And the way you get power is you do things that resist it. Like you have some sort of meaningful goal, and then power is only generated when you are put in a situation where you really don't want to do the thing. You have some sort of resistance, but you do it anyway. And
Makes total sense. It's how you develop
so
muscle.
simple.
It's like you have to pull the weight in the opposite direction of gravity in order to, you have to have resistance in order for your muscle to get stronger.
Right.
You don't get stronger moving in with the direction of resistance. You get stronger by moving against the direction of resistance. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's like we don't get pumped up watching Rocky or Dragon Ball Z because he's like has a grand old smile every training session. He's like, oh, I love training. I love doing this. Doesn't suck at all.
I have this metaphor that I use called the emotional gym, and it's a way to transform your experience, your everyday experience of reality, into an opportunity to grow your inner capacities, which is like instead of seeing a setback as an opportunity to get frustrated or crestfallen, you can see it as an opportunity to develop or increase your capacity for forbearance, for patience, for resilience. And until you feel uncomfortable, you are not getting stronger. You're not building anything. I once heard that Arnold Schwarzenegger used to start to count his reps only when they started to hurt. Because until he started to feel that, he wasn't getting stronger. That was all just prelude to that moment. And until you feel uncomfortable, you're not really doing anything in terms of like growth or development.
I could imagine some people would see that as some sort of masochistic
Sure,
thing.
there is some masochism.
But it actually sounds like the obvious formula for happiness, because a core component of well-being and happiness is gratitude. So this kind of, like you're saying, like seeing it as an opportunity for growth, it's almost like you're grateful for the suffering.
Sure. I mean, that's high level though, man. It's like the apotheosis of that is like the Job in the biblical book, who it's easy enough to praise God when everything is going well. But even in the midst of all of his loss and suffering, he still praised God, at least for a while. We can also talk about ADHD if you want to go in that direction as well. Because that got even more backlash when I went there than the depression.
Really?
Mm-hmm. People love ADHD. Yeah. A couple people, perceived what I said about depression as to be like victim blaming. Yeah. But more people, when I talked about ADHD, were just like, you're obviously ignorant. There are ways to diagnose ADHD, et cetera, et cetera.
Me personally, I wanted some ADHD medication. And so I just looked at the
criteria.
Yeah, I just looked at the questions and I was like, well, I wouldn't even be lying if I answered in the affirmative for most of these. Like, yeah, I've got trouble focusing. Sometimes I can't, I'll think of different things while I'm talking to someone.
Sure.
It just all seems like kind of normal.
If a normal person were to crack open the DSM, he or she would think that they are the most mentally ill person on the planet, because most normal people can remember moments in their lives where most of those criteria are appropriate. There are, however, enormous differences in the presentation of mental illness. Mental illness, I believe, is a real thing. I see you have the myth of mental illness on your shelf over there, which is, I wouldn't go as far as Saz, that mental illness just doesn't exist. I do agree with his points about how it's often a consequence of power to define like what is ill and what is not. Mm-hmm. And it's usually as a analog for what is socially unwanted or unacceptable. So it's like culturally bound. So he has some good points, but to say that all mental illness is just a social construct, I think is going too far. Okay. Like some people are very mentally ill. I serve on the executive committee for the Napa County Mental Health Board, and I've done that for a few years. And one of my duties is to go into different facilities that the county has contracts in and evaluate, how they are discharging their services. And if you've never been to a locked psychiatric facility before, it's very eye-opening. You get to see manifestations of mental illness that are generally obscured from the vast majority of people. And I think a lot of people who could, in the privacy of their own rooms, without any kind of comparable comparisons, that would say, oh, these things all apply to me, if they went to a locked facility, they would say, oh, that's what they're talking about. That's what they're talking about. But I think that because there isn't often that basis of comparison for most people, and a lot of those symptoms can be interpreted personally in wildly different ways, most people can find themselves in at least one of the mental illnesses in the DSM.
I guess we didn't establish yet how you were saying that basically or in one of your videos, that the criteria used to confirm whether someone or to diagnose someone with a mental illness are not objective. Is that for all mental illnesses?
Yeah, that's right. And in that video, I quoted the DSM-5, which is written by the American Psychiatric Association. And in every one of the diagnostic categories, they talk about methods of evaluation. And in every single case, it'll say something like, there are no diagnostic assessments for this mental illness. Some people will take issue with that. Like, I remember one of the mental illnesses I singled out was ADHD. And in response to that, I got a lot of feedback from people who were like, Orion, you clearly are not familiar with the literature. You're not familiar with this study that shows that there's different cortical densities between ADHD folks and other folks. You're not familiar with this study about divergent neural network associations between these two populations. And I haven't read every study for sure, but I have read a lot of the studies actually. And there's a number of issues with those studies. First of all, the issue is that we've already conceived of differences we've already assumed that there are differences in the construction of the study. Because they already say that there's ADHD populations on the one hand and folks without ADHD. So the study is designed to already assumes that those differences exist in the classification of the two different segments of the experiment. So that's called selection bias. It's assuming what it's trying to prove, okay?
So are you saying that basically a better design study would be to look at the whatever might be cortical thickness of this area of the brain and then check who has ADHD?
Yeah, that would be more convincing for me. Is like give a bunch of specialists whatever data you want, whether it's brain scans or EKGs or EEGs rather, whatever it is, and have them be totally blind and ask them on the basis of that data to sort them and then to correlate that with the self-report of symptoms. I think that would be more convincing. Maybe that study exists, but I haven't read it.
So you're not saying ADHD doesn't exist, but that the way that it is determined is very fuzzy.
Well, it's extremely fuzzy. And the fact of the matter is that all of those folks who wrote to me and said, no, there's differences in cortical density, there's differences in different anatomical structures of the brain, etc., they weren't diagnosed with ADHD according to those tests. I don't know a single person who has gone into a medical facility and asked and was diagnosed with ADHD as a consequence of a brain scan. If that was diagnostic, then they should be giving brain scans to people, especially to children. The problem with that perspective is that if you actually believe that there are valid and reliable diagnostic tools for, say, ADHD, then why not demand that they use them prior to prescribing a medication?
Okay.
If you believe that they exist and they're not being used, that is an enormous ethical violation. That's like giving someone blood pressure medication without even taking their blood pressure. Why would you do that?
It's like, do you get angry? Okay, take this blood pressure medication.
So there's actually more problems with the way that psychiatric medicine is practiced if there were diagnostic evaluations in these mental disorders, because they're not being utilized.
So you're saying that, okay, let's assume that you could diagnose ADHD with a brain scan. Then it would make most sense to do the questionnaire. And then if everything seems like they have ADHD, it's like, okay, before I give you this pill, let's do the brain scan.
Yeah, that makes a lot more sense, right? It's because we know that the pills can and do actually change brain chemistry, sometimes in the long term. And we're giving these medications to children in particular at very sensitive periods of their development of their nervous systems.
So I was just going to ask you, for the study you were mentioning where the density of certain areas of the brain is different, and then they're saying, okay, these people with the higher density are the people with ADHD. Are those the people who are already taking medication?
I don't know.
Okay.
In some studies, they might be. So this is why I often don't talk about studies on my channel, because I actually read studies. Most people do not read studies. Even in grad school, most of my colleagues weren't reading the studies. They'd read the abstracts. Most people don't even read the abstracts. They read popular articles written by people who read the abstracts.
Oh, yeah.
And sometimes they don't even read those articles. They just read the headlines of those articles written by people who read the abstracts. There's an enormous problem with that, because it actually is very difficult to learn the language of scientific studies, to learn the language of statistics. It's not really intuitive. It took me years of reading, and I didn't understand a lot of what I was reading in the beginning, because it's almost like a foreign language. You have to become fluent in statistics and study design. And there are so many ways to get the outcome that you might be looking for in ways that would be very difficult for most people to pick up on, right? So the fact that a study showed doesn't really hold a lot of weight for me. There are some well-controlled studies out there, but the vast majority of them are not that well-controlled.
Have you looked at any nutrition research?
No, I'd like to learn more about nutrition. I don't know as much about it as apparently you do.
I would say it's even worse.
Well, sure, because
depending on the study.
Well, I guess you can call yourself a life coach, and that's sort of like the unofficial psychologist. And you can call yourself a nutritionist, right? And that's an unofficial medical doctor or something like that. And it seems it's very confusing, the nutritional space. It's like, I'm sure that you could Google, you could find some sort of study or somebody saying that pretty much any food is, this person going to say it's good and you absolutely need to eat it. And this one, oh, it's terrible, you need to avoid that like the plague. It's so confusing to make sense of that field these days.
Right. I mean, you could definitely pull out an array of studies and say, based on all these studies, we should literally eat nothing except maybe fish.
But let's go back to the ADHD thing for a second here, because let's give my critics a chance here. So let's assume that there were consistent, reliable correlates on the neuroanatomical or neurophysiological level with ADHD. Okay. I think that's the best that we can say, that there's correlations here. Okay. That still can create some issues. And let me explain why. Let's say that, God forbid, you were involved in some sort of like bike accident. And so you went to the doctor and you got a brain scan to see if you had some sort of concussion. That would make sense, right? Now, if after a few hours the doctor came back into the room and said, well, I got some good news and some bad news. Well, the good news is you don't have a concussion. The bad news is that we found a brain tumor. Could you then say, oh, there must be some mistake. I don't feel like there's any problem in my mind. And the doctor's going to say, no, you don't understand. It's like the tumor, you're not going to feel anything, but it's there. And you might think, well, I don't have any problem speaking. I don't have any issues. I don't think that's really an issue. The doctor says, no, you have to do something about this, or else you might have a serious consequence. You might die. The point is that your feeling is completely irrelevant to the existence or the severity of the problem. Now, by analogy, let's say you did that scan, the doctor comes in and says, okay, we looked at your brain scan. The good news is you don't have a concussion. The bad news is that you have ADHD. Because we see in this scan correlates to that mental illness. And you would say, well, doctor, that's impossible. I don't have any trouble concentrating. I don't feel like I'm distractible. I don't feel like I can't focus. And he said, no, you don't understand. No, this is ADHD. You have it. And if you don't take an intervention, it's going to get worse. Like, I don't think that you would accept that. Yeah. And the reason is that even if at best these two things are correlated, whatever shows up on the brain scan in this disease, well, there's multiple ways that could show up on a brain scan. It would only be diagnostic on some level of ADHD if that presentation were only uniquely associated with ADHD. And that's probably not the case, especially if it's just a correlation.
So you said that if it were the case that we had objective criteria to confirm a mental illness, then that would suggest that some of the practices going on today are quite unethical. What did you mean by that?
Well, because that's not how mental illnesses are being diagnosed. If there were objective assessments like scans or blood tests that could be used to definitively diagnose mental illnesses, why aren't we doing them?
I have read things that, for example, the hippocampus is smaller in depressed people.
Sure, but if you got a brain scan and the doctor said, hey, look, your hippocampus is small, you must have depression, you'd be like, actually, I feel fine. Yeah. Because we know that the size of hippocampi varies, just like the titer level of serotonin varies. People who have depression have high serotonin levels. People with depression have low serotonin levels. People without depression have high serotonin levels. People without depression have low serotonin levels. Same thing with, I'm sure, the size of the hippocampus or the cortical density of the frontal lobe or anything that you want to discuss is that there's going to be natural variation. And some folks in that natural variation will fall into this category and some will fall into that category. It can't be used causally to say that because this has by the opposite token, you have a tumor, you're in this category. Like, we know that you have this issue, and we can do potentially a biopsy and examine this and say, no, this is this type of brain cancer.
I see.
It's the only thing it could be.
So you're not saying that mental illness can't affect the brain. You're saying that as we are now, we can't take the reverse step of check the brain and then say you have mental illness and then prescribe.
I don't think that we can. And we don't, even if we could, which would be potentially an even bigger problem, like I said. Obviously, what we think affects our brain, right? Like, how could it not? Like, that's how learning occurs. It's like through our experience. And obviously, the brain changes over the lifespan as a consequence of our experiences. So what we sense and what we think must have some impact on brain anatomy and brain processing. But it's so complex. It's very difficult to say, this neuron here, if I were to poke it, you're going to think about your childhood house. But if we poke, I might even have a neuron in that location. Or for me to think about a childhood house, I have to poke these 3 neurons over here. It's like the actual idiosyncratic way that the brain and the mind get enmeshed in an individual is very particular. Mm-hmm. So it's not going to be the same. I mean, we even know that, people can literally have hemispherectomies. They can have half of their brain removed and they can live. Now, do they experience some deficit in functioning as a consequence of that? Absolutely. But it's not like if they take out their left hemisphere, they never can speak again. And this is to do with the fact of neuroplasticity.
In Norman Doidge's book, The Brain That Changes Itself, I might get this wrong, but he was explaining how this person had lost their sense of balance due to some issue with the brain. And then they were able to put in a device that it was like what's that accelerometer?
Okay.
Right. Like it's in the phone. So the phone can tell its position in space. It had a device. They had an accelerometer connected to the tongue to send electrical signals to the tongue. And so I think it was the part of the brain that is controlling the tongue was now turned into also the part of the brain that balances the whole system. Something like that. Sure. So to your point, it's just that the brain can change in these such unique ways. So that person's brain would obviously function completely differently.
Well, here's another, like maybe more prosaic example. Like there was an experiment that was done where normal people would wear these glasses where because of the way that they were constructed in the visual field, left and right were switched. And so like I can see that my glass is here on my left, but if I were wearing my glasses, it would appear on my right. And so of course, in the beginning, everybody was wearing the glasses. They'd be reaching for their cup of water over here and be like, oh, where is it? Oh yeah, I'm wearing the glasses. So it's actually in the opposite direction of where it looks like it is. And eventually they get used to that. Like if they wear those glasses 24/7, after a few days, they learn. And I wonder what would happen if they wore those glasses for years.
Yeah.
Like absolutely, there would be some changes in probably the visual processing center of the brain, where it's basically like, I don't know what's going on, but based on the new information we're getting, we got left and right mixed up. And so we need to switch this thing around. And if they, after some time, took those glasses off and were actually seeing reality clearly, it would take another period to readjust. And so I think that if we experience things in our mind, in our consciousness long enough, they obviously do create changes in our brain, but it's so hard to know how that actually occurs. I don't know if anybody really understands that. Like we know in general that this part of the brain is associated with auditory processing, or this part of the brain is associated with the regulation of the autonomic nervous system, etc. But like on a very gross level.
We're not at the point to say like we understand the brain well enough to say, okay, your brain looks like this, so antidepressant or Ritalin.
No way. Yeah. We're nowhere close to that. Nowhere close to that.
Mm-hmm. And so is the situation with these kind of fuzzy diagnoses, yeah. Diagnoses in the DSM, is the situation getting better with each edition of the DSM, or how is the situation changing? Because it's in its fifth edition? Okay.
Well, are there more people who are diagnosed with mental illness now, today, in 2024, than there were 30 years ago? No. We're in the midst of a serious mental health epidemic, where according to some of the statistics, either between 1 in 4 and 1 in 5 Americans have a diagnosed, not just a diagnosable, but a diagnosed mental illness. There probably are more that could be diagnosed if they were to go to a diagnostician, right?
Could some of this be a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy? For example, you have the nocebo effect. So it's like the reverse of the placebo effect, where you say, oh, this is going to have terrible side effects. This pill I'm going to give you, just be ready. And then they experience the side effects, even though that pill has never been associated with those side effects. So for example.
Yes, that can happen.
Okay.
I made an episode about this called Understanding the Symptom Pool. Have you heard that term before, the symptom pool?
I can guess what it means, but I haven't
It's a very important concept with respect to mental illness. And those who would like to learn more on this should read the book Crazy Like Us, which is a very approachable book for the lay audience about how especially Western psychiatric mental illness has been proliferated around the world. So the example I gave in the video has to do with the diagnosis of anorexia in Hong Kong in the 90s. I think that's what it was. So first, let's talk about the symptom pool. I mean, don't you, if mental illnesses were exclusively genetic or have an exclusive physical or physiological component, we wouldn't expect mental illnesses to disappear so quickly and certain other mental illnesses to appear so rapidly. Because there just haven't been enough time for those things to arise in the gene pool, right? And we definitely see that. It's like no one experiences neurasthenia anymore. Neurasthenia or glove paralysis. Have you heard of glove paralysis? These are both 19th century mental illnesses that nobody has anymore, but were actually fairly prevalent among the aristocratic elites of Europe. Glove paralysis is the phenomenon where people feel like they can't move their hands, their fingers, like just from here down, hence glove, right? And that is hysterical in like a technical term, because examination of all of the nerves found that they were intact. And if the nerves are intact here, if you can move this, you should be able to move the muscles in your hand. Like, it didn't make any sense. Neurasthenia was sort of like a fatigue and a restlessness with the world, kind of a thing. No one has heard of these terms before, and no one gets diagnosed with them, even though they were, like I said, fairly prevalent at a time, right? So what we have to, here's the thing, is that it's very difficult for me to know what's actually going on inside of you, another human being. I have to rely on communicative signals that you either consciously or unconsciously present in order for me to make a reasonable deduction as to your internal state. Now, if you're suffering and you need me to understand that because you want some sort of relief, you want some sort of succor or assistance, you have to communicate that distress to me in a way that I can understand. Otherwise, it's just noise and no signal, and I won't know that I'm supposed to help you. So in any given society, at a certain time and a place, there is what is called the symptom pool. No one really decides the symptom pool, though people influence all the time, the symptom pool all the time, consciously or unconsciously. But the symptom pool is like that time and place's sanctioned expression of distress. If you present your distress in these ways, I will recognize it as distress and I will help you. And if you don't recognize it, if you don't communicate your distress in that way, I might not be able to recognize it as such, and so you might not get any help. Now, the crazy thing about the symptom pool is it's created like on the collective unconscious level. Like there's not some evil genius behind the scenes who's deciding what all the symptoms for successfully expressing your distress is going to be for a time and a place. It's like it's decided on an unconscious way as like an emergent phenomenon in a given society. And the people who are feeling distressed are generally not conscious of choosing those symptoms to express their distress. Some people are. We call those malingerers. They're trying to like bake the system. But most people are actually, they feel that their symptoms really express their distress. Just like if you were to talk to a woman in 19th century Germany, she would really feel that her hand couldn't move. She wouldn't think that she was doing this to herself or that there was any kind of choice or volition involved. Her hand just stopped moving, and that's a problem. We don't see that as much anymore because, for whatever reason, we don't really acknowledge that as a legitimate form of symptomology because it had been so thoroughly debunked, people couldn't like unconsciously select it because it didn't have the patina of validity.
So if I went to a doctor and said, Doc, I think I have, okay, maybe I wouldn't say that. I would just say, Doc, I can't move my hand. And then he checks the nerves and they're all totally fine. What would be the reaction today? He would just think he would just assume it's something else. Of course, he wouldn't say it's glove paralysis.
You can't even diagnose glove paralysis anymore, as far as I know. I mean, after some tests, they might gently refer you to a therapist or a psychologist. It's usually one or the other. It's either the body or the mind when there's a problem, right?
I see.
So this is the example from the book, which is that no one person can control the symptom pool, but we influence the symptom pool in all kinds of ways. And one of the most common ways that a symptom pool is influenced today is through campaigns of awareness, which are generally not designed to exacerbate the problem. The people who launch these campaigns of awareness think they're doing a service to people. And so typically what happened was this. A bunch of psychiatrists from the West came to Hong Kong in the early 1990s and said, look, I know it's not too much of a problem here, but we're experiencing this enormous rise in a very serious disease called anorexia where we're from. It's important, though, to understand. So we're going to help you to try to get ahead of the problem. We've seen that it only shows up really in certain people. It tends to affect women more than men. And not only that, it seems to affect women of moderate to high socioeconomic status as well. Like maybe you've heard about that recent celebrity who came out and said that she had anorexia, her brave account of her struggles with anorexia. That's an example. So we shouldn't consider that just because somebody is famous or wealthy or powerful that she's not struggling on the inside. And we're doing this to you because we want you to create diagnostic screens that will help you to see this problem earlier so that you can intervene earlier. You're welcome. And so what do you think happened?
I would guess a lot of Hong Kong girls got anorexia.
They sure did. Within a year, the rates of anorexia went up over 1,000% in Hong Kong. Now, sometimes when this general argument is given, people say, well, that's just because they had better screening tools. And so they got better at, it's not that they created more anorexia. The anorexia was already there, they argue, and the screening tools just got better at revealing the scope of the pre-existing problem. But that can't possibly be true. Like thousands and thousands of dangerously malnourished women, young women, would not have gone unnoticed.
Yeah.
Okay? So I don't think that that's appropriate as a counter argument in this case. And what the author of Crazy Like Us, Waters, I forget his first name, but Ethan Waters argues is that these well-meaning psychiatrists basically created a model that said, this particular disease is one associated with high status women. It affects women, and not only that, it tends to affect higher socioeconomic status, like this celebrity. Like it's pretty clear that we don't see anorexia in societies and communities that are struggling to eat. Like that doesn't exist. The conscious refusal to eat suggests that you have food to eat, to refuse. Do you understand? And so it naturally can only emerge at scale in privileged sections of the population. And so these doctors are saying that this seems to detrimentally affect high status women like celebrities. And so by association, they're actually holding up that, okay, if I also have this, I might also be a high status young woman like these celebrities. And I don't think anybody was conscious of thinking that, but I think that was one of the unconscious consequences of this. And they also said that this is just deserving of our understanding and our support. It needs to be cared for. It needs to be understood. So now there's a bunch of secondary gain that come out of expressing distress in this way. So in this way, awareness campaigns, unfortunately, can sometimes make problems worse than they otherwise would by introducing new ideas into the symptom pool. Let's put it that way.
That seems like it would have massive implications. So, for example,
Yeah.
Kurt Cobain chose to quit the game. And I mean, he's like this huge rock star, beloved by everyone. But then there's also this kind of narrative around him of oh, he's this romantic, tortured soul.
Sure.
And then he ended up quitting the game. Do you think that could, that as an example?
Yes. There's a great book that exemplifies this. Great because it's a perfect example, not because I really endorse the book. But it's a book by Kay Redfield Jamison called Touched by Fire. She's written a number of, I liked her Night Falls Fast, which is understanding suicide. That's the subtitle. Touched by Fire is her historical and autobiographical account of bipolar disorder or manic depressive illness, as she calls it, or was called for quite some time. And on some level, she's talking about how there is so much prevalence around all of these genius authors and painters and poets and scientific minds. It's almost like in order to be a genius, you have to be crazy. Like that's, I think, kind of the tone of that book. And she associates herself with that population. Like what a brave confession that she's making, that she also has manic depressive illness, after she just spent 300 pages talking about all of these brilliant creative individuals who suffered from the same, and more or less making the argument that their madness facilitated their creativity.
It's like the alcoholic writer.
As a very prosaic example, I remember when I was a kid, I really wanted to be smart, or at least seen as smart. And for me, part of that meant wearing glasses. Like smart people wear glasses, right? You see that in all the media and all the cartoons, the smart people always wear glasses. The problem was there was nothing wrong with my eyes. So I remember one day, I think I was probably like 9 or 10. I went into the optometrist for my annual checkup and I decided I was going to lie. I was going to fudge what I saw on the eye chart to make the optometrist think that my eyes were bad. The problem was I didn't lie convincingly, like, because I was 9, I would, instead of seeing like an E as an F, I would see like an F like a W, no one would ever see it that way. And so my lie got found out by the optometrist and he did not, in fact, prescribe me glasses. And by that, in that same visit, my sister got prescribed glasses. My younger sister got prescribed glasses instead, which was the height of injustice in my mind, because, I was crying because I didn't get the glasses. She was crying because she did get, it was quite a day. But that's my point, is that in my imagination, this wearing glasses was associated with being perceived in a certain way. And I know that's a very simplistic example, but it occurs on a deep and nuanced level in many, many people, in more ways than we'd like to admit.
What's funny, this reminds me of a book that I read. It's called Don't Sleep, There Are Snakes. Have you heard of it? It's written by a linguist, Daniel Everett, and it talks about his time.
I've read a number of his other books. I haven't read that one.
Oh, you have? Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. So he's talking all about the Piraha, this tribe in the Amazon rainforest. And he learned their language over several decades, and it was a very unique language to where, to not get into it too deep, but just very quickly, Chomsky had this universal theory of language, universal grammar, and then Daniel Everett basically said that has to be wrong because this language does not have that particular thing. So very unique people. They don't have numbers. They don't use colors. They'll say that looks like a tree leaf instead of green, or that looks like blood instead of red. So anyways, his initial mission was to convert them to Christianity. He went there as a missionary. And after all this time learning the language, he finally became very confident in his ability to use the language. And so he thought he was going to finally drop this really impactful story on them about why he went to Jesus. And he tells this story about how he was suffering so much, and the thing that was a huge piece of suffering for him that ultimately led him to accept Jesus as his savior was his stepmother committed suicide. And so he finished the story, and he was expecting them to be very impressed. And they just said, "What? That's stupid. Pita Hut don't kill themselves." And they just laughed at him. And so the point is that sounds very patronizing, of course, but it's just such a foreign concept to them that someone would end their own life. And so I'm wondering if, does the fact that how should I put it? Is the perception of suicide in society potentially encouraging it, or?
I don't know if it would be a stretch to say that society is encouraging.
Yeah, no, not by, or not intentionally, of course, but I mean, like, it's seen as an option. It's a kind of romantic notion. We have like Romeo and Juliet, or the hurting artist like Kurt Cobain I mentioned, or there was the Netflix show. Have you heard of that? 13 Reasons Why.
I've heard of it, but I haven't seen it.
It's basically,
it's a young girl commits suicide in that?
Yeah, 13 reasons why she chose to commit suicide.
I see.
And it was very tragic, of kind of like, oh, it didn't go well with this person did this to her, and poor her. It was almost kind of justifying her, pretty much. That's basically what it's 13 Reasons Why, right? It's justifying her suicide. So this is a take that I don't know if it'll remain in the interview, but because it's pretty spicy. But I'm just trying to say, based on what you said about the awareness of it, like, not only is there a higher awareness of suicide, but it's can almost generate certain, maybe reinforced in terms of like the sympathy it generates, or the kind of,
sure,
like,
a lot of people can potentially envision what their funeral would look like, and all the people that they feel didn't adequately appreciate them in their life are there crying and feeling regretful that for all the harm that they committed onto the person in question, right? That can be a depressive fantasy for sure. I think Beck called suicide a permanent solution to a temporary problem, right? And he said that it was generally the result of poor insight and problem-solving skills. And that most people, when they do commit suicide, they do it not necessarily because they want to, not usually because they want to die, but because they want to escape pain. And they've arrived at a place where they think that there is no other alternative to escape pain except to end the physical substrate that can experience the pain, which is, in the vast majority of cases, not true. And this, like we were talking about, can lead to all kinds of suboptimal decisions, right? Because emotions are living things. And so if the depression wants to continue to exist, it's going to focus attention on certain solutions, and it's going to restrict attention on other alternatives. Like, it won't even acknowledge that they exist. And as the depressives tend to withdraw and isolate, they can get involved in a more extrapolated inner fantasy about what might occur, because they aren't really being exposed to any kind of counterfactuals, because they're withdrawing. They're withdrawing into their fantasy, the depressive fantasy. And one of the things that I like to remember is, so there's a wood here in Japan. I think it's the second most common place in the world to commit suicide. I don't know if you're aware of that. I think it's
Aokigahara, I think. Uh-huh.
But the number one place, at least historically, has been the Golden Gate Bridge, which is in my backyard. And they've put up higher fences and phone calls with suicide assistance hotlines and things like that. And I think that it's dropped, right, as a consequence. But I watched a documentary a long time ago about this phenomenon, jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge. And it's interesting because some people actually survive this enormous drop. The vast majority of them don't. but some actually do survive. And some of them were interviewed for this documentary, and they unanimously said that the first thing that they experienced when they actually went over the ledge was intense regret. It's like when they finally start falling, the fantasy is broken. And because the onrush of gravity, the severity of what they've actually done is so significant that it intrudes on whatever fantasy they've constructed in their minds. And it's like they wake up.
Mm-hmm.
And they all say, as they were falling, they wish that they hadn't done it. There's also a possibility, I think it's mentioned either in that movie or somewhere else, that people choose different methods of attempting suicide. And sometimes when people jump off the bridge, it's almost like a divine test, because people can sometimes survive that method. And so on some level, some people believe that it's sort of like, well, I'm going to put this in God's hands or somebody else's hands. And if I'm really meant to be saved, I'll be saved. And that will give me the proof that I need that my life is worth living.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, it doesn't always happen. Now, I've worked with a number of people who have close family members who have committed suicide. And I will say that it is very, very hard on the survivors. It's hard enough to grieve the death of somebody you care about. But when somebody dies as a consequence of suicide, it is so much more complex, because wrapped up in the usual grief and pain of loss is often a lot of anger over the perceived selfishness of the act, a lot of confusion, especially if they didn't leave a note or they don't know why this happened, and also self-recrimination, because a lot of people believe that they should have been able to see this coming and they didn't, and that they might be at least partly responsible for what happened. So survivors of suicide have a really tough time. And that's actually one of the interventions, one of the better interventions in working with suicidal patients, is getting them to understand how difficult it would be for the people who they would leave behind. A lot of people in their darkest moments won't continue to live for themselves, but they might continue to live for somebody else.
To go back to the point with the, what was the book? Crazy Like Us.
That's the one about anorexia.
Right. So I guess I kind of jumped a little too far, but
no pun intended, I'm sure.
Yeah. What I guess what I was trying to say is, like, we're very copycat species, monkey see, monkey do, right? So when you see celebrities talk about their anxiety or depression on TV or on the internet, isn't that kind of inappropriate? Like, I mean, shouldn't that be the conclusion from the Crazy Like Us things? So, I mean, similar with the suicide thing, I would think that it's a sin, right? In the Bible. Am I misremembering?
I'm sure it's in there. I don't think that it's a good idea to kill yourself. No.
No, yeah, but I mean, the point is, it's what's the word? Admonished. It's like there's no sympathy for it. It's like you're a sinner if you do that.
It's also a crime in a lot of places. Yeah. Like, as strange as that may seem, because there's no one left to prosecute. But there's all kinds of legal and ethical and religious prohibitions against suicide. Sure.
Mm-hmm. So I guess the easier point to talk about is, for example, people discussing, celebrities, well-respected people discussing their mental issues online, right? Like, it seems like it would serve to generate awareness, and to some degree it probably is very good, but then it's like, how often are we talking about the peripheral negative effects of this, like the kind of unnecessary spreading of it?
Yeah, because it does do that, just like those well-meaning doctors did in Hong Kong all those years ago, for sure. Now, there could be another reason why celebrities or powerful people do make these, let's say, strategic confessions, because there are certain things that are like appropriately inappropriate to confess, and there are things that are inappropriately inappropriate to confess that no celebrity is going to ever voluntarily talk about, right? So certain things are a little bad, but not that bad enough that you shouldn't talk about them at all. And by confessing some of those things in the former category, the appropriately inappropriate things, that can be very beneficial to the person in question. It can, among other things, make you more likable because you don't seem to be so perfect, like you're more approachable. And it can also help to dismantle envy. A lot of people who enjoy a great deal of privilege for whatever reason in our society because of its power, fame, wealth, they are basically targets for the envy of those who don't have those things and want those things, right? And if they were to stand up on TV and say, well, fuck yeah, my life is great. Are you serious? There's nothing wrong with being a millionaire, I'll tell you that. Like, no one's going to like that guy. You understand? And that's going to make it more difficult for him to continue to be a millionaire. And so one way to dismantle envy, or sometimes even the guilt associated with having privileges that other people don't enjoy, is to confess appropriate, inappropriate, negative aspects of that enviable quality. But oftentimes, if it's done, it takes a lot of tact to be able to do that, because oftentimes people hear that and they just think, oh, so sad. Millionaire has problems too. It's like, I'll take that problem. It has to be done with a great deal of tact and sincerity. Otherwise, it just sounds like, champagne problems. So the point is that there's lots of reasons why people might communicate their problems. They might communicate their distress. It's not so straightforward.
I guess there's a bit of a contagion there, right? So like if maybe you have a very high status person confessing to some kind of mental issue, and then that is a strategic move for them, that's effective for them. But then maybe someone who's just a normal person, they think, oh, if I confess my issues, it'll help me in some way, but it just kind of makes them look less appealing or weaker.
It can, but that can also be, it's tricky here because sometimes those confessions can be a sincere communication in the attempt to receive necessary help. They can also be exploited in games of power and control. And unwittingly, we often encourage the latter by giving the former. The more that we give help and care and exception to people who make those confessions, the more likely we're going to incentivize more people to make those confessions, even whether or not they're actually sincere. That's called secondary gain. And not only that, sometimes people might initially sincerely confess their distress, and as a consequence of all the secondary gain they receive, it makes it harder for them to ever let go of the distress. It's like people suffer. People are subject to having some really tough times and going through some really tough moments. Sometimes it's appropriate to take a knee. Sometimes it's appropriate to sit this one out. Sometimes it's appropriate to receive care and consideration. But there's also a time for you to stand back up and get back into the game. And the longer and the more comfortable we make it on the bench, the more comfortable we make the bench, the harder it is for anyone to get back up. Does that make sense?
Of course, yeah. One of the things I wanted to ask you about was this idea of depression as an issue of evolutionary mismatch. So I was reading this textbook called Evolutionary Psychiatry, and in the chapter about depression, they were explaining how data on hunter-gatherer tribes shows that depression is exceedingly rare.
Most mental illnesses are exceedingly rare in hunter-gatherer tribes.
Yeah, and so it was something like, I think nowadays depression is 1 in 6 in America. 1 in 6 people have it. And then a 1989 study on a particular people from Papua New Guinea. It was like 1 in 2,000. And what they were kind of laying out in the book is that there can be many different reasons to arrive at a depressive state, but it is unnatural, or it's a consequence of modern society or whatever is going on nowadays. Not necessarily society, but I mean whatever changes we've experienced as a whole. Being indoors, less exposure to sunlight, different types of food, more processed food, all these different kinds of things is setting up to where we remain in a depressed state for a very artificially long time. So, for example, if someone is grieving, it's very understandable for them to seem like they have depression. But then, if they stay there for an abnormal amount of time, that is something that only really happens nowadays, or in civilized societies.
Well, there's a lot there to unpack. One of the dirty little secrets of both therapy and psychiatry is that, according to the research, the vast majority of mental illnesses spontaneously remit. They run their course.
Like even schizophrenia?
That one is a little bit more chronic and pervasive, but for example, Zimbabwe has better clinical outcomes associated with schizophrenia than the United States. In general, the more industrialized the medical care of a society, the worse its mental health outcomes are.
Wow.
And part of that is because kind of what you're discussing is that when somebody in America has schizophrenia, it's immediately conceptualized to them that this is a lifelong disease. They will always have this. They will always have to take their psychiatric medication. And they may even need to be sequestered from the rest of the population for their own good and safety. Whereas, this might be a bit of an oversimplification, but in Zimbabwe, they're just like, oh yeah, that's Uncle Alex. He sometimes talks to people who aren't there, but we love him. They kind of, they're not going to ship him off to an institution. They don't have the resources to do that, and often, but they might not want to do that anyway. They make allowances for people, and they find ways to continue to integrate them into the community. And there's still ways, absolutely, that people with schizophrenia can be useful to themselves and others. But we often don't even allow people with schizophrenia to do that in industrialized societies. Another thing to keep in mind is that when Kraepelin first began to conceptualize mental illnesses in the early 20th century, I think he only recognized 3 mental illnesses by his analysis both of the culture that he lived in and through the historical record. Those were dementia praecox, which we might call schizophrenia, manic depressive illness, which we now call bipolar, and what we might call like excessive melancholia or severe depression. Like, there are examples of all 3 of those mental illnesses in the historical record of almost every culture that has left a record. And so those seem to be the ones that have the greatest likelihood of having a more genetic basis to them. But that said, they were exceedingly rare. Like, there was no historical culture where 1 in 6 people suffered from melancholia or dementia praecox or whatever it was. You know what I'm saying? Nowadays, the DSM-5 has over 300 mental illnesses. And they also, from the DSM-4 to the DSM-5, moved away from categorical diagnosis, which is like you either have, let's say, ADHD or you don't, to a spectrum-based diagnosis, which is that you have maybe mild ADHD to moderate to severe, okay? Which I think, among other things, only increases the catchment of people who would be appropriately diagnosed. But there's lots of evidence that suggests that a lot of mental illnesses spontaneously remit. And even when it comes to schizophrenia, it's like people who have that disease, they go through periods of more intensive psychosis than others. And oftentimes that psychosis is exacerbated by stressors, by conflict. If a lot of those things can be mitigated and a person is embedded in a community of people who care about them and they have consistent routines, they might not really, it's like they might have it, but they might not have it. You understand? It's like being a diabetic who controls their blood sugar level. Like the effects of that diabetes never really get expressed, even though the person never stops being, let's say, a diabetic or having a predisposition towards diabetes. Because there's even some debate in the medical profession about whether, can you cure diabetes? Some people believe that you can, some people believe that you can't. The people who believe that you can cure it on some level think that it has to do with, your blood sugar levels. And if they're in this range for long enough, you don't have the syndrome that we refer to as diabetes. But I think it's fair to say that with a lot of people who struggle with mental issues, they might always have, let's say, a predisposition towards that problem. Like I have a predisposition towards depression because I suffered from it for several years when I was younger in a very severe way. But because I've now made significant changes to a lot of my life, the syndrome doesn't get expressed anymore. Now, if I were to let go of some of those structures and routines and relationships that keep me healthy and safe, would the depression would be subject to returning. It's possible, right? Like I might not ever get to stop doing those things, just like a diabetic might not ever get to stop checking their blood sugar levels. But if you do those things, the disease becomes functionally invisible in your life. So do you even have it at this point? I don't know. Some people might say that you do. Some people might say that you don't.
I think you'd really like Chris Palmer's book. So he makes this long argument for why many mental illnesses at their core are a metabolic issue. And recently a paper came out just this month, and it was on 3 case studies. These are just case studies, but it was 3 case studies of people who had lifelong recurrent major depressive disorder. And they did a ketogenic diet. And then there's some kind of questionnaire. It's like pH something Q questionnaire for diagnosing depression. I think there's many ways to do it, but that is at least the way that these people evaluated the depression. So it went from like basically the highest score possible down to a 4 in 6 weeks, and a 4 is below the threshold for being classified as having depression. And then within 7 or 8 weeks, it was at a 0 of like absolutely no, hint of the disease. Like the one of the comments was like, I feel as happy and excited as I was in high school or something like that. And so one of the things I was thinking of, so the book Evolutionary Psychology talks a lot about how, the way we interact with each other is totally different, and the way our kin groups are set up and our social groups is like completely different from before, and the amount of socializing we do is totally different. But also, actually, the book doesn't mention this specifically. The book does mention the significance of diet, but one thing is that hunter-gatherers would have been going in and out of ketosis. So they would have periods where they didn't gather enough food, and so their stored sugar would be depleted enough to where they would go into ketosis. And so the point is this situation where modern people never really go into ketosis is arguably very unnatural.
I mean, even among, I would say, most likely primitive agriculturalists, they would go into ketosis at least some time, because there would be times when the food wasn't readily available or the crops would fail. There was a lot of uncertainty back then. Like they certainly didn't have the kind of food preservation technologies that we have today. In some respects, my understanding, the beginning period of agriculture was way more uncertain than hunter-gatherer lifestyles. You might think it's the other way around, but there's so many variables where an entire crop can be lost because of one hailstorm. One night where the frost is allowed to persist on the crops for too long. They're all dead. And there goes 8 months of effort. So I would assume that even in pre-industrialized agricultural societies, there would be a lot of ketosis as well, because there was a lot of, I would assume, variability with respect to the availability of food.
We got onto this because you were explaining how many mental illnesses spontaneously remit.
Yeah.
But then is it harder for them to remit if they are adapting their body to these different pharmaceuticals? Or does that change?
Well, it creates a different problem.
Okay.
Because, like I said earlier, with respect to depression, the best meta-analyses demonstrate that there is no relationship between serotonin levels and the incidence and experience of depression. However, if you were to take SSRIs regularly, you will absolutely change not only your serotonin levels, but your neuroanatomy as well. Because the body generally wants to restore homeostasis. In the beginning, when a person starts taking SSRI, there is an excess of available serotonin, which is what generally creates the felt effect of SSRIs, the kind of like that ebullience that you get, usually between 3 to 5 weeks after starting, that can last for 3 to 6 months. But after that, that feeling generally tends to disappear, which is why people sometimes hop from one antidepressant to another, because they're trying to restore that feeling, which naturally dissipates as the brain starts to restore its previous level of homeostasis. What we know is that if you're regularly putting in exogenous serotonin in the form of an antidepressant medication, your body will start producing less of its own endogenous serotonin. It will even start to form fewer terminal buttons to become less sensitive to the circulating serotonin in your brain. It's like how in testosterone replacement therapy, when you start using it, your testicles stop producing their own testosterone. Like that's the expected consequence of taking TRT, because the body is saying we already have enough. I don't know where it's coming from, but we don't need to make any more. Okay? Now, what then happens is that after some months or some years, the brain has come to expect a certain regular incursion of exogenous serotonin. If that were to suddenly or even gradually be removed, the homeostasis would be altered again. There would be lower productions of endogenous serotonin, and the brain would be less sensitive because of those withdrawal of the terminal buttons to the serotonin that was circulating, okay? And so often what that means is the feelings of distress come back, because we've actually messed with brain chemistry and neuroanatomy as a consequence of habituating to the antidepressant. And so that's absolutely going to create changes in somebody when they're not taking the medication. And too often that's interpreted as, oh, that's the depression coming back. When it might be more appropriate to call that a rebound effect associated with the withdrawal from the antidepressant. This can be really bad with anti-anxiety medications. They call that rebound anxiety. And many people who have titrated off regular use of anxiolytics have said that the rebound anxiety that they experienced as a consequence of stopping to take their anxiety medication was significantly worse than the anxiety they were experiencing that motivated them to seek the medication to begin with.
Wow.
And so you just go back on. And so now you become a lifetime consumer.
Sounds very lucrative.
Can be. I mean, if these treatments cured depression, shouldn't we see less depression?
Yeah, right.
Shouldn't we see less anxiety? Shouldn't we see... And do we?
I think I read that since 1998, the use of antidepressants has quadrupled.
Well, yeah, and they also can be prescribed for other reasons as well. Like antidepressants aren't only prescribed for depression.
What else are they prescribed for?
They could be PDD, premenstrual dysphoria disorder. They could be prescribed for anxiety conditions. They can be prescribed for obsessive compulsive disorders. I mean, a lot of these medications weren't even developed to treat the frontline disorder that they're most associated with. A lot of psychiatric medications are like discovered because of the side effects that were noticed when they gave them to somebody else. Like one of the most popular examples of that is like Viagra. Do you know how they've found Viagra? I mean, I think they were trying to come up with a drug to treat angina, like chest pain. And they gave it to some guys and it made their dicks hard. And they said, oh, I guess we have an erectile dysfunction medication on our hands. And so Viagra became associated with that, but not because that was their intention. A lot of our medications are prescribed for the side effects that they produced when they were first developed.
It's like we went through all this trouble to produce this drug, and it seems to have this effect. So
every solution needs a problem.
Right. Didn't you say that the criteria, say for depression, has gotten the threshold has gotten less and less with each DSM? I think you said that before you couldn't diagnose someone with depression if they were grieving.
Yeah, that was generally known as the bereavement exclusion. And that was present up until the DSM-4, but they got rid of that for the DSM-5.
Wow.
And like I said, they also shifted from a categorical diagnosis to a continuum spectrum-based diagnosis.
I see.
Whereas minor depression requires fewer self-endorsed criteria today under the DSM-5 than depression did in the previous manifestation of the DSM.
But then does that mean, say, if you have minor depression, are you still likely to get prescribed an SSRI, or are they going to say, oh, it's minor depression, just chill?
It could go either way. I mean, you could certainly walk in, I assume under the previous regime, and talk to a PCP, primary care physician. And let's be clear, most psychiatric medications are actually not prescribed by psychiatrists. They're prescribed by your family doctor, your PCP. And say, I know that I only have 4 of these criteria, and to have depression, I need to have 5. But it's really it's hard for me to work. It's hard for me to concentrate. I feel really bad. You could still get a prescription, most likely.
And then our patients explain this whole rebound effect. Is that explained to them?
No, I don't think a lot of doctors know about it.
Oh, wow.